All right, we're going to go ahead and go over the Chapter 22 warm-ups. One of them is completely about writing conclusions, and then the other one has got a phantoms and a panic on it. Okay, and so we'll talk about that right there. It's got your phantoms and your panic. All right, so this first one, we talked about, we had the proportion of Aledo residences and Hudson Oak residences who have a swimming pool, and wondering if the proportion of Aledo residences is greater than the proportion of Hudson Oaks residences who have a pool. We had a p-value that was lower than alpha. So therefore, since the p-value is low, we reject HO. And so we are rejecting HO. And we do have evidence that the proportion of Aledo residences who have a pool is higher than the proportion of Hudson Oaks residences who have a pool. So this little section right here is just straight up what HA is, but in context, okay? So that's all you're saying is you do or you do not have evidence of HA in context. All right, the second one, I changed the p-value so that it was actually greater than alpha. So since the p-value is greater than alpha, then you do not reject the null. And so if you do not reject the null hypothesis, of the Aledo and the Hudson Oaks. So we do not reject this, so it will hold. If this holds, then I don't have evidence of HA. So I'm not saying the null is true, I'm just saying I don't have evidence to reject it. So I fail to reject it. There is not evidence to suggest all this stuff right here, HA, in context, okay? So instead of writing it over, I just put it right there. All right. So there are your test conclusions. Let's go on to the interval conclusions. So on this first one, I'm talking about the Fort Worth and Aledo residences who recycle. So remember how important it is that you include the direction in which you subtracted, because when I see there are negatives here, then I know the Fort Worth proportion was lower. So I am 95% confident that the true difference, these are not about the proportion. These are about the true difference between the proportion of Fort Worth and Aledo residences who recycle is between 9% and 15% lower for the Fort Worth residents. And then we include our zero statement. And in this case, 0 is not in the interval. So that means there is evidence to suggest that there really is a difference in the recycling rate or the proportion of Aledo and Fort Worth residences who recycle. Before I do that last problem, I just wanted to mention something to you that I'll be looking for as I grade. And so I just remembered that, so I'm going to actually come back here. I saw many conclusions as I was going around helping you on Friday, where it said there is evidence to suggest something that, you would say like the Aledo residences who have a pool is higher than the Hudson Oaks residents. Well, that makes it sound like it's the number of residences. And so I want you to think about that. Just talking about the number of residences is wrong. Because if you say Aledo is bigger city than Hudson Oaks, then that you're comparing the number of one of them to the number of the other one, not the proportions. You are finding the difference in their proportions so we can compare them properly. For example, over here, the number of Fort Worth residences, the number of Fort Worth residents who recycle is probably much higher than the number of Aledo residences who recycle because it's so much bigger of a town. However, the proportion of them who recycle ends up being lower than the proportion, okay? So it's this, you have to reference the proportion, okay? And here's this last one. We've got a negative and a positive in our interval. So I'm 90% confident that that difference in the recycling rate, that's the same as like saying the proportions of the Fort Worth and Aledo residences, is between. This first one being a negative number indicates 5.2% lower for Fort Worth residences, up to, that's your little connector if you're struggling on how to say it, 8.5% higher for the Fort Worth residences. And 0 is in the interval, so that suggests there could be no difference in their recycling rate. 0 in the interval consists there could be no difference. All right, so that's what one of the quizzes will be like, just making sure you have a handle on the conclusions. Let's now go on over to the warm-up where you do a full phantoms and a panic. This problem was about the proportion of Canadians and Brits who say they read or they have read at least one book in the past year. So I have kind of issues with this as far as like needing to make sure it's in present or future tense. So to alleviate that, this is like the current amount of Canadians or Brits who say something. So these are the current amount who say something about the past, but this is currently, I'm inferring about the proportion of them currently who have done something. All right. I want to actually show you this in this format, so I'm going to have this typed out here. I did my problem where I called the first proportion the Canadians and the second proportion the Brits. If you did yours different than that, never fear. I will show you that in just a minute, what that makes different. So let's go with this. The proportion of all such Canadians that have read at least one book in the last year. So this is current, some English something, I don't know, some special something or other on that, but it's talking about the current proportion of them. And the proportion of Brits who say that they have read at least one book in the last year. The hypotheses are that they are equal. The question wondered, is the proportion of Canadians higher than the proportion of Brits? Now, right here, it says, do these results confirm a higher reading rate in Canada? So however you wrote your things, you need to say the alternative is higher for Canada. Now, FYI, some people asked me about what to do on the null hypothesis. They thought, am I supposed to say something about, some people might assume there's a higher for Britons? So they were wondering, should this go like this for our null hypothesis? And that answer is no. No. We will, now sometimes when you get more advanced in statistics, you might see that. But here in Statistics 1, and as far as the College Board is concerned, we always are starting out saying they are equal, and then we go forward with that differently. Okay, moving on. So there's that, your alternative. Here are the conditions. Randomly selected Canadians and Brits was stated, both of them. Notice how I say everything about both. Independent. 1004 is less than 10% of all such Canadians. 1009 is less than 10% of all such Brits. And here was that special additional independence condition saying that, yes, I'm pretty sure the Canadians and Brits are independent of each other. I did not have any British Canadians that I counted in both groups. Large enough. So I rounded. I wonder if I think this is supposed to be a 3 here. 863 is greater than or equal to 10 successes, and 141 is the failures. For the Brits, 817 is greater than or equal to 10, and 192 is greater than or equal to 10. So the approximately normal model applies. There's your assumptions. The name is a two proportion z-test. When I had my Canadians first, my z-score was a positive 3.01 with a p-value of 0.0031. That is less than alpha. So my decision is to reject the null. Since I reject HO, there is evidence. If you wrote just HO here, that's okay. Because we do context here, there is evidence to suggest that the proportion of Canadians that have read at least one book is greater than the proportion of Brits that have read at least one book. All right. Now, what if you had changed your order and you made the Brits P1? Most of this would have been the same. Here's what would have been different. Of course, if you had called your P1 the Brits and your P2 the Canadians, then here's what it changed. Your HA looks like this, and your z-score is a negative. Everything else is the same. The p-value comes out the same. The conclusion is the same. All good. All right, but let's go ahead and talk about the interval, problem 2. And you, of course, are able to do this on your quiz. Do not rewrite the parameters and assumptions because they are the same as they were in problem 1. So you start with the n. Name is a two proportion z-interval. Define the way you subtract. That is incredibly important. If you put Canadians in first, then you got positive interval here. So you're 99% confident that the true difference in the literacy rate is between 0.7% and 9.24% higher for the Canadians. See, these were positive numbers, so our Canadians were higher. And then here's the zero statement. 0 is not in the interval, so there is evidence to suggest that there really is a difference in the literacy rates of the two countries. Now, if you had subtracted the other way, see this? If you had done the Brits minus the Canadians, then look at your interval. Yours is similar, but it's the negatives and it's the flipped order, but the conclusion is essentially saying the same thing. I'm 99% confident that the true difference in the literacy rates is between 0.7% and 9.24%. Because they were negatives, we have lower for the Brits. And same conclusion here. Since 0 is not in the interval, we have evidence to suggest there is a difference in the literacy rates. Now, this is not what your problem has, but I just wanted to refresh your memory on what do you do if you end up with a negative and a positive. Well, this one is saying I'm 99% confident that true difference in the literacy rates between the Canadians and Brits is between, okay, 4%, and that's a negative, so it's lower for the Canadians. So 4% lower for the Canadians. Up to what this one says, 6%, and it's positive, so it is higher for the Canadians. So 4% lower for the Canadians, up to 6% higher for the Canadians. Both times I'm talking about the first item in my subtraction. Lower in one regard, higher in the other. And in this case, 0 is in the interval. So there could be, I'm not saying there could be no difference in the literacy rates of the Canadian and Brits. All right. So there is the review of how to do a full phantoms and panic. So I hope You are good with that? Going over those conclusions and your phantoms and panic.